We won't be held hostage. My name is Alan Howell, and I represent the Organization and Political Action Committee Revolt Against Plutocracy. The point of this video is to show you why vote blue no matter who is not a viable strategy in the current political climate. And it hasn't been for 70 years, but we'll get into that in a moment. The first order of business is to explain, based on research by French economist Thomas Piketty, why poor and poorly educated voters will not vote for a corporatist candidate, no matter who. So let's start with him. The empirical findings of his very thoroughly researched report are that in the 50s and 60s, labor, and especially the poor and the poorly educated part of the labor force, would vote left, leftist parties, labor, socialist, democratic parties. But over the years, that has shifted. And so now in the United Kingdom and the United States and in France, the lower educated and lower income voters are more likely to vote right. And since the 70s and 80s, higher educated voters, those with college degrees, have been more likely to vote left, and wealthier voters are more likely to vote right. And this led to him writing a paper called The Brahmin Left versus the Merchant Right. And what we have now, we have two political parties that represent the wealthy, that represent the elite, whether they're economic elites or intellectual elites. And the rest of the voters he calls populists, although he puts a question mark after the word. He's not sure if that's the right word or not. But his data are extensive. He shows in France, using the percentage of university graduates voting left versus right over the years. Then he superimposes the United States, the data from the United States, and then the United Kingdom. And what we have over 70 years are clear trends that show how the political parties are leaving behind the poorly educated and the lower income voters. And what he's also showing us is that unless there's someone to vote for, the poor and poorly educated will not vote. So when we study voting trends, for example, this graph shows exit data from the 2016 elections. When we study data of voters, we see that even people who do traditionally vote in the last election would not be shepherded, would not be sheepdogged into the Clinton camp. A full 12% of Bernie Sanders voters, for example, voted directly for Trump, which was especially devastating in swing states, or other candidates, or did not vote. But if you include the data of Piketty, you see that the elephant in the room, the sizable elephant in the room, is the voting bloc that consists of poor and poorly educated voters. And according to the data, the voters who are poor and poorly educated now will not turn out for anyone other than someone who has traditionally been called a democratic socialist. But it doesn't matter what you call them. What they perceive is that don't give a shit-itis has pervaded the political scene. Neither the Democrats nor the Republicans have given a shit about working class people over the last 70 years. And that's why when somebody says vote blue no matter who, and they say it to someone who hasn't been helped and whose families haven't been helped, whose parents haven't been helped, say this to typical union workers or to typical non-union workers, say truck drivers or any other kind of laborers, what you find is that they aren't excited about Democrats or Republicans unless they're hoodwinked in some other way through racism or some other tricky maneuver to get people to think of each other as the enemy. Now, when I have had conversations with vote blue no matter who Democrats, and I tell them that there's a sizable group of people who are Bernie or bust, they want to blame the whole problem on Bernie or bust people. And they want to solve that problem by saying, well, just tell them how stupid they are. Tell them how ridiculous they're being. And even if I could, it won't help because we're not dealing with all of the different factions who would just stay home. When you're talking to Bernie or bust voters, you're talking to voters. When you're talking about the poor and poorly educated, and also the millennials, if you're talking current college students or recent college graduates who can't find work, or to new voters, 17 and 18-year-olds who are just coming onto the scene, you're not going to persuade them that way. They just aren't going to vote unless you can tell them that somebody is going to change things. Now, what Bernie says, he says, I'm not necessarily going to change things unless I can get people organized to stand behind me, to stand up with me, and to demand change. And that's where a movement needs to start, a revolution, a true revolution. So think about all the different categories of voters: the poor and poorly educated, the young, the very young, and the fairly young. A lot of those factions will not vote for a blue, like a Biden or even an Elizabeth Warren, no matter what. They just won't come to vote. Some people will vote directly for Trump, as we have seen in the past election, and some will vote Green Party, and a lot will stay home. Or they'll vote Socialist Party, they'll vote for some other third party. Now, in economic times that favor Wall Street, what we've been taught to call a good economy, although it's only good for the 1%, we won't defeat Donald Trump without all of the legions of voters who typically don't vote. So in a good economy, quote, we absolutely have to have the disenfranchised voters show up. In an economy that like in a recession, if we have something like happened in 2008, then all bets are off, and we don't know what we'll get then. But if the economy continues to favor Wall Street, the only possible way to defeat Donald Trump is by rallying the troops who have typically been left out. There are tricks up the sleeves of both Republicans and Democrats in their think tanks and in the way they organize. I need to mention cross-check. Cross-check is an interesting phenomenon. If you're wondering what it is, it's a way that both Republicans and Democrats, in typical fashion, controlled opposition fashion, where they disenfranchise voters. So if you go to cross-check, if you do a search on cross-check, what you'll find is that cross-check, even though it's a Republican thing, it's designed to keep out voters of color. Innocently, on the surface, what it does is to make sure that voters don't vote in more than one state. But because people of color have more similarity in names, it tends to leave out a lot more people of color. And so it's just a way, really, to do voter suppression. And with voter suppression in place, then you can see how the Republicans and the Democrats are working together to keep voters out. And then and which voters? They not only keep out voters of color, they keep out the poor and poorly educated, who also are more likely to have similar last names, similar first names, similar names. The other thing I needed to mention in passing is that the Democratic Socialists of America have passed a resolution called the Bernie or Bust resolution. And even though there are 56,000 members, it sounds like good news on the surface, but what we're seeing is, and these are very active politically people, but what we see here is that they say that they won't endorse anyone other than Bernie Sanders, but they leave it to their membership to decide whether or not to vote for a corporate candidate. And the other part of the story that I have to tell you before I get to the environment is that labor movements are critical in trying to get things changed, and no other candidate besides Bernie Sanders is really serious about getting the labor force involved the way they're starting to in Europe and in South America. If you look at the Yellow Vest movement, if you look at labor strikes like trucker strikes in Brazil and other places, what you find is that a political revolution is not being encouraged by Elizabeth Warren or Joe Biden. And I've talked a lot about that in other videos I've made. But for the purposes of this video, I just want to help you see why Vote Blue is not a viable strategy and the main reason. So instead of yelling at Bernie or bust people for us to hop out of the pot, what we really need to do is explain why, with the disenfranchised voters, you're not going to escape 4 more years of Donald Trump unless you endorse Bernie Sanders, unless you get him in the first round of the primaries, in the first round at the convention. You're just not going to get where you want to get, which is, by all the studies, Democrats are most intently focused on defeating Donald Trump more than any other issue that they actually care about. The last point then is the climate, and we've got the feedback loops that are, like I mentioned, that are heating up the planet faster than even Bernie Sanders seems to realize. And if you talk about saving the planet from extinction, then you really need to figure out that nobody else is going to do it. We have to solve the economic injustice, and really that's at the root of the climate injustice. And so if we can get a revolution started and we can get all of us involved who are typically not as involved, then we'll save the day. So please tell your friends, vote blue no matter who, just isn't going to cut it, and that Bernie Sanders right now is the only candidate who can possibly defeat Donald Trump and save the planet. It is that grave, and it's time to get the word out. So until next time, keep on burning.